It's 2:47 a.m., and you're alone at a gas station. The fluorescent lights flicker overhead, casting dancing shadows across empty parking lots that stretch into absolute darkness. You think you're safe under those harsh white lights, but tonight, we're going to shatter that illusion forever. What I'm about to share with you are 8 true stories that will make you question every late-night stop you've ever made. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are real encounters reported to police, documented in security footage, and burned into the memories of people who barely escaped with their lives. Before we begin, I need you to understand something. After tonight, you'll never look at a gas station the same way again. You'll find yourself checking your rearview mirror more often, locking your doors a little faster, and maybe, just maybe, you'll choose to drive on empty rather than stop at that isolated station on the edge of town. Because what lurks in those parking lots after midnight isn't always human, and it's definitely not friendly. Story 1. The Maintenance Man Masquerade. Sarah Martinez thought she was being paranoid when she first noticed him lurking around the gas station at 2:30 a.m. on that cold Tuesday night in Phoenix. The man wore what appeared to be a legitimate maintenance uniform: navy blue coveralls, with a company patch, a tool belt that looked well used, and work boots that had seen better days. He moved around the property with the kind of confidence that comes from familiarity, checking doors and windows like he had every right to be there. But something deep in Sarah's gut screamed that this was wrong. She had been working the graveyard shift at this 24-hour station for 6 months, and she knew every maintenance worker, every delivery driver, every regular customer who wandered in during the dead hours of the night. This man was a stranger, and strangers didn't just appear at isolated gas stations in the middle of nowhere at nearly 3 a.m. When Sarah called her manager to verify the maintenance schedule, her hands were already trembling as she dialed the number. The response made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. There was no maintenance scheduled for that night. No new workers had been hired, and absolutely no one should have been on the property except her. As she hung up the phone, she watched through the security monitors as this imposter methodically tested every door handle, every window latch, moving with the systematic precision of someone who had been planning this visit for a very long time. He wasn't trying to hide from the cameras. In fact, when he noticed the security lens focused on him, he did something that would haunt Sarah's nightmares for years to come. He looked directly into the camera, his face illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights, and smiled the most chilling, predatory grin she had ever seen. Then he raised his hand and gave her a slow, deliberate wave, as if to say, "I see you, and I know you're all alone." The next 3 hours became a psychological torture session that pushed Sarah to the edge of sanity. The man didn't try to break in or force his way inside. Instead, he played a much more sinister game. He would disappear for 20 or 30 minutes, just long enough for Sarah to think he had given up and left, then suddenly reappear at a different window, pressing his face against the glass and leaving greasy handprints that spelled out messages she couldn't quite read in the condensation. He would tap on the windows with his tools, creating rhythmic patterns that seemed almost like Morse code, as if he was trying to communicate something specific. Sometimes he would stand perfectly still in the parking lot, just staring at the building for what felt like hours. His presence a constant reminder that Sarah was trapped inside while he controlled everything outside. The most terrifying moment came when Sarah realized that this wasn't a random encounter. This man had been watching her, studying her, learning her routines and vulnerabilities. He knew exactly when she worked, knew she was always alone during the graveyard shift, and knew that help was at least 20 minutes away, even if she managed to call the police. The stolen maintenance uniform wasn't just a disguise, it was a carefully crafted persona designed to get close to his target without raising suspicion. When police finally arrived at dawn, they found the man's abandoned uniform in a dumpster behind a nearby restaurant, along with tools that had been stolen from a legitimate maintenance company 3 towns over. But the most chilling discovery came when they ran the fingerprints from the window handprints through their database. They belonged to a convicted stalker named Robert Chen, who had been systematically targeting young women working alone at night shift jobs across 3 states. The investigation revealed that Chen had been watching Sarah for over 2 months, learning her schedule, her habits, even her personal life through social media stalking. He had stolen the maintenance uniform specifically to gain access to the gas station property, and the tools were meant to help him break in when the moment was right. Police found detailed notes in his apartment describing Sarah's daily routine, photographs taken from a distance, and a disturbing collection of personal items that could only have been obtained by someone who had been following her outside of work as well. The most horrifying revelation was that Sarah wasn't his first victim. Chen had used the same maintenance worker disguise to stalk and terrorize at least 6 other women across the Southwest, and 2 of those women had simply vanished without a trace. Sarah's decision to call her manager and verify the maintenance schedule had quite literally saved her life, because Chen's pattern showed that he typically escalated from stalking to abduction within a matter of hours. The case remains open because investigators believe Chen had accomplices, other predators who helped him identify and track potential victims, and they suspect there are more women out there who experienced similar encounters but were too frightened or embarrassed to report them to authorities. Jake and Emma were driving through the back roads of rural Tennessee when their fuel gauge needle dropped into the red zone, leaving them with no choice but to stop at the only gas station visible for miles in any direction. The place looked like it had been frozen in time since the 1980s, with rusted pumps, cracked concrete, and a hand-painted sign that had faded to barely legible letters. As Jake began filling their tank, Emma noticed a white sedan parked at the far edge of the lot, positioned in the shadows where the station's lights barely reached. What made her skin crawl wasn't just the car's presence, but the fact that she could see 3 silhouettes inside, sitting perfectly motionless, all facing in their direction, with an unnatural stillness that suggested they had been waiting there for quite some time. When Jake tried to pay for the gas, the card reader displayed an error message, forcing him to go inside the station and leave Emma alone by their car in the oppressive darkness of the Tennessee night. The moment Jake disappeared through the station doors, the white sedan began to move with the slow, deliberate pace of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to run. Emma watched in growing terror as the vehicle crept closer, stopping just close enough for her to make out the faces of the 3 men inside. Faces that wore expressions of cold calculation and barely contained excitement, like hunters who had finally cornered their quarry after a long and patient wait. She fumbled for her phone to call Jake, but the rural location offered no cell service, leaving her completely cut off from any possibility of help or communication. The men exited their vehicle with synchronized precision, moving not with the urgency of people in a hurry, but with the confident, unhurried gait of predators who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it many times before. Emma's survival instincts kicked in as she locked herself inside their car and began laying on the horn with desperate, continuous blasts that shattered the eerie silence of the rural night. The sound brought Jake running from the station, and as they peeled out of the parking lot with tires screaming against the asphalt, Emma kept her eyes glued to the side mirror, watching the 3 men who made no attempt to chase them or even move quickly. Instead, they simply stood in the middle of the empty road, watching their escape with the patience of seasoned hunters who understood that not every hunt ends in success, but who also knew that there would be other nights, other isolated travelers, other victims who wouldn't be quick enough or lucky enough to escape. The most chilling aspect of the encounter wasn't the immediate threat, but the realization that these men had clearly done this before. Their coordination was too smooth, their positioning too strategic, their calm demeanor too practiced for this to be anything other than a well-rehearsed routine. Later investigation by local authorities revealed that the white sedan had been reported in connection with several disappearances along that stretch of highway over the past 2 years, always involving couples or lone travelers who had stopped at isolated gas stations late at night. The 3 men were never identified, despite clear descriptions provided by Emma and security footage from the station that showed their faces. What made the case even more disturbing was the discovery that the gas station's card reader had been deliberately sabotaged, forcing customers to go inside and leave their companions vulnerable in the parking lot. The station owner revealed that this wasn't the first time the payment system had mysteriously malfunctioned, and each previous incident had coincided with reports of suspicious activity in the area. Emma and Jake's escape was attributed to their quick thinking and Emma's decision to use the car horn. But investigators believe they were moments away from becoming the latest victims in what appeared to be an organized operation targeting vulnerable travelers on remote highways. Story 3. The basement dweller Marcus had been working the night shift at a rural Tennessee gas station for over 2 years when he began to suspect that he wasn't as alone as he thought during those long, isolated hours between midnight and dawn. It started with small, seemingly insignificant things that he initially dismissed as his imagination or simple forgetfulness. Food disappearing from the employee break room, the bathroom showing signs of use when no customers had been in the store, and strange, muffled sounds that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the building during the quietest hours of the night. The gas station was an older structure built in the 1960s, and Marcus knew there was a basement level that had been used for storage until flooding issues forced management to seal it off years before he was hired. At least that's what he had been told, and he had never had any reason to question that information until the night he discovered that the basement wasn't as abandoned as everyone believed. The revelation came when Marcus was reviewing security footage from the previous week, looking for evidence of who might be stealing from the break room, when he spotted something that made his blood freeze in his veins. On the grainy black and white monitor, he watched a figure emerge from behind the building. Not from the parking lot, not from the road, but from what appeared to be ground level, as if the person had literally crawled out of the earth itself. The figure was a man, disheveled and dirty, with wild hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in months. But what made Marcus's hands shake as he watched the footage was the moment when this stranger looked directly into the security camera and smiled the most insane, predatory grin Marcus had ever seen. A smile that conveyed not just madness, but a deep, intimate knowledge of Marcus's routines, his vulnerabilities, and his complete isolation during those night shifts. The investigation that followed revealed a horror that Marcus could never have imagined in his worst nightmares. The basement hadn't been properly sealed at all. Instead, there was a hidden entrance accessible from outside the building that had been used by someone who had been living in the flooded lower level for months, possibly even years. This unknown individual had created a makeshift living space in the damp, moldy basement, surviving on food stolen from the station, using the employee bathroom when Marcus was distracted with customers or deliveries, and most disturbingly, watching Marcus through gaps in the floorboards and ventilation systems. When police finally gained access to the basement, they discovered not just evidence of long-term habitation, but detailed notes about Marcus's daily routine written on the moldy walls in what appeared to be human waste, along with stolen personal items including Marcus's spare uniform, his employee ID badge, and photographs that had been taken of him without his knowledge. The most terrifying aspect of the discovery wasn't just that someone had been living beneath Marcus's workplace, but the realization of how long this person had been studying him, learning his habits, and planning something that the evidence suggested was far more sinister than simple theft or trespassing. The basement dweller had been documenting Marcus's schedule with obsessive detail, noting when he took breaks, when he was most vulnerable, and when the station was completely empty of customers. Police found makeshift weapons, restraints, and what appeared to be plans for accessing the main floor of the station during Marcus's shift. The individual was never caught, despite an extensive manhunt, and investigators believe he simply moved on to another location when he realized his presence had been discovered. Marcus quit his job immediately and moved to another state, but he still receives anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Calls where no one speaks, but where he can hear the sound of someone breathing in that same basement, suggesting that his nightmare may not be over and that some predators never truly give up their chosen prey. Story 3. The Pack Hunters. Lisa thought her German Shepherd Rex would be enough protection for their late-night gas stop, but even her loyal companion seemed to sense something fundamentally wrong about the industrial area where they had pulled in at 1:45 a.m. The gas station sat like an island of harsh fluorescent light, surrounded by a sea of empty warehouses and abandoned lots, the kind of place where screams would echo off concrete walls with no one around to hear them. As Lisa began filling her tank, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Not the random activity of normal customers, but something far more coordinated and deliberate. 3 men had appeared from different directions with the kind of synchronized timing that spoke of careful planning and extensive practice. One emerged from behind the building where no legitimate customer would have any reason to be. Another materialized from across the street as if he had been waiting in the shadows. And the third stepped out of a car that Lisa suddenly realized had been parked there when she arrived, though she hadn't noticed anyone inside at the time. Rex was growling now, his hackles raised and his body tense with the kind of primal fear that animals feel when they recognize a predator, even when their human companions are still trying to rationalize away the danger. The 3 men weren't approaching directly, which somehow made their presence even more menacing than an outright confrontation would have been. Instead, they moved with the calculated patience of experienced hunters, positioning themselves to cut off every possible escape route while maintaining the pretense of normal activity. One man pretended to use the payphone near the station entrance, though Lisa noticed he never actually dialed a number and kept glancing in her direction with an intensity that made her stomach churn. The second man acted like he was checking his tire pressure, but his movements were too deliberate, too staged, and he kept moving closer to her car with each fake inspection. The third simply leaned against his vehicle, smoking a cigarette and watching Lisa with a smile that contained no warmth, no friendliness, only the cold satisfaction of a predator who believed he had successfully cornered his prey. The psychological warfare continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, with the 3 men slowly tightening their circle while maintaining their facade of innocent activity. Lisa's hands began shaking so violently that when she tried to replace the gas nozzle, she dropped it, the metallic clang echoing across the empty lot like a dinner bell announcing that the hunt was about to begin. That sound seemed to be the signal the men had been waiting for, because they immediately abandoned their pretenses and began walking toward her with the confident stride of predators who no longer needed to hide their intentions. Their coordination was perfect, their timing flawless, and their approach methodical. This wasn't their first hunt, and Lisa realized with growing horror that she and Rex were about to become the latest victims in what was clearly a well-rehearsed routine that had probably claimed other travelers who had been unlucky enough to stop at this isolated station during the vulnerable hours of the night. Lisa and Rex made it to their car just as the first man reached for her door handle, his fingers actually making contact with the metal before she managed to lock the doors and start the engine. As she peeled out of the station with tires screaming against the asphalt, she could see the 3 men in her rearview mirror, and what she saw there would haunt her for years to come. They weren't running after her car or shouting in frustration at their failed attempt. Instead, they were standing together in the harsh circle of light cast by the station's fluorescent lamps, calmly watching her escape with the patience of professional hunters who understood that not every hunt ends in success. Their body language suggested disappointment but not defeat, the kind of resigned acceptance that comes from experience and the knowledge that there would be other nights, other isolated travelers, other opportunities to perfect their deadly craft. The investigation that followed Lisa's report revealed a pattern of disappearances along that stretch of highway that stretched back over 3 years, with at least 7 people vanishing without a trace after being seen at gas stations in the industrial district during late-night hours. Security footage from Lisa's encounter showed the three men's faces clearly, but despite extensive searches and nationwide alerts, they were never identified or apprehended. What made the case even more disturbing was the discovery that the men had been using the same hunting ground for years, apparently rotating between several different gas stations in the area to avoid establishing a pattern that might attract police attention. The coordination of their attacks suggested military or law enforcement training, and investigators theorized that they might be part of a larger network of predators who shared information about vulnerable targets and optimal hunting locations. Lisa's escape was attributed to Rex's protective instincts and her own quick reflexes, but forensic analysis of the scene revealed evidence that the men had been prepared for resistance. They had weapons, restraints, and what appeared to be a detailed plan for disposing of evidence, suggesting that their previous hunts had been far more successful and that Lisa had come within seconds of joining the ranks of the disappeared. Story 4. The Jumper Cable Trap. David's car had been making strange noises for weeks, but he never expected it to die completely in the parking lot of a remote Montana gas station at 4 a.m. on a February morning when the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero. The battery had given up without warning, leaving him stranded in a place where cell phone towers were nothing but a distant dream, and the nearest town was 40 miles away through mountain passes that could be treacherous even in good weather. He sat in his dead car for nearly an hour, watching his breath fog up the windows while he tried to figure out his options, when salvation appeared in the form of a middle-aged man in a pickup truck who pulled up beside him and offered to help with jumper cables. The stranger seemed like an answer to prayer, friendly, helpful, and equipped with exactly what David needed to get back on the road. But as the man began connecting the cables to David's battery, small details started to accumulate that would later make David's blood run cold when he had time to process what had really happened that night. The Good Samaritan's truck was running, but when David casually placed his hand on the hood while they worked, the metal was stone cold, suggesting the vehicle had been parked there for hours rather than having just arrived to help a stranded motorist. The jumper cables were still in their original packaging, brand new and obviously purchased recently, as if they had been bought specifically for this encounter rather than being standard emergency equipment that any helpful driver might carry. As they worked on the connection, the man made casual conversation that seemed innocent enough at first, asking David where he lived, whether he was traveling alone, if anyone knew his current location, what his final destination was, and how long he had been stranded. The questions felt natural in the context of small talk between strangers, but there was an underlying intensity to the way the man listened to the answers, as if he was gathering intelligence rather than simply making conversation to pass the time while they worked on the car. What should have been a 5-minute procedure stretched into 20 minutes, then 30, with the helpful stranger seeming to find endless reasons why the jump wouldn't work, why they needed to try different approaches, why David should step away from the car and let him handle the technical aspects of the repair. David began to notice that the man wasn't actually trying to start his car. He was stalling, keeping David outside in the brutal cold, isolated and increasingly vulnerable as hypothermia began to set in, and his thinking became less clear. When David suggested they try a different approach, or perhaps call for professional help, the man's entire demeanor shifted like a mask being removed to reveal something predatory underneath. The friendly smile vanished, replaced by cold calculation, and his helpful suggestions became subtle commands designed to keep David away from his vehicle and dependent on his supposed rescuer's expertise and goodwill. The moment of terrifying clarity came when David pretended to check something under his hood and caught sight of the man's truck interior through the passenger window. Zip ties scattered on the seat, a roll of duct tape on the dashboard, rope coiled on the floor, and what appeared to be a tarp folded in the back. These weren't the tools of someone who had stopped to help a stranded motorist. They were the implements of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Someone who had deliberately positioned himself at this isolated location to prey on vulnerable travelers. David realized that his car hadn't broken down by coincidence. The man had been watching, waiting, possibly even sabotaging vehicles to create the very situation that would make potential victims grateful for his assistance and willing to trust him completely. David's survival instincts finally overcame his desire to be polite and trusting, and he made a desperate sprint for the gas station, abandoning his car and his possessions in favor of reaching the safety of witnesses and locked doors. Through the station window, he watched the helpful stranger calmly pack up his jumper cables, load his predatory toolkit back into his truck, and drive away without any sign of urgency or concern, already scanning the highway for the next stranded vehicle. The next vulnerable traveler who would be grateful enough for help to ignore the warning signs that David had almost missed until it was too late. The police investigation that followed revealed that David's car battery had been deliberately drained, using a device that could be attached and removed without leaving obvious evidence, and that similar incidents had been reported across 3 states, always involving lone travelers stranded in remote locations during the most vulnerable hours of the night. The man was never caught, but investigators believe he was responsible for at least 6 disappearances of people whose cars had mysteriously broken down in isolated areas, people who had simply vanished along with their vehicles, leaving behind only security footage of a helpful stranger offering assistance that turned out to be anything but helpful. Story 5. The Follower's Game. Rebecca first noticed him at a gas station outside Denver on a Tuesday evening in March. A tall man in a faded baseball cap who seemed to be watching her from across the parking lot with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She told herself it was just her imagination, that people look at each other all the time without it meaning anything sinister. But something about his unwavering stare and the way he positioned himself to keep her in his line of sight felt deliberately predatory. When she saw the same man 2 days later at a completely different gas station 50 miles away, standing in the exact same position relative to her car, and wearing the exact same clothes, Rebecca felt the first cold fingers of real fear creeping up her spine. By the third encounter, at yet another station in a different town along her regular route, she knew with absolute certainty that she was being hunted by someone who had made her the focus of an elaborate and terrifying game of psychological warfare. The stalking wasn't random or impulsive. It was methodical, calculated, and demonstrated a level of planning that suggested her pursuer had been studying her routines for weeks, or possibly months before revealing himself. He never approached her directly, never spoke to her, never even acknowledged her presence in any obvious way, but his very existence in her peripheral vision became a constant source of terror that poisoned every moment of her daily life. The man would park his vehicle where she couldn't help but see him, follow her into the convenience store, but stay several aisles away, and time his movements so that he was always pumping gas when she was ready to leave, forcing her to walk past him and feel his eyes tracking her every step. The psychological torture was exquisite in its subtlety. He was always just present enough to let her know she was being watched, but never obvious enough for her to prove to skeptical friends or family members that she was actually being stalked. Weeks passed. The game escalated with the patience of a predator who understood that fear was a weapon that became more effective over time. Rebecca started varying her routes, changing her schedule, even staying with friends in different parts of the city. But somehow he always found her, always managed to be there when she needed gas, always positioned himself where she would be, forced to see him and know that her attempts at evasion had failed. The most terrifying escalation came when she began finding him hiding behind her car when she returned from paying for gas, not making any threatening moves, not saying anything, just crouched there in the shadows like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His smile during these encounters was the most chilling thing Rebecca had ever seen. Not angry or lustful, but patient and satisfied, like someone who was enjoying a game that only he fully understood, and that he was confident he would eventually win. The psychological warfare reached its peak when, Rebecca realized that her stalker wasn't just following her to gas stations, he was learning her entire life, her work schedule, her home address, her social connections, and her daily routines with the thoroughness of someone who was planning something far more sinister than simple observation. She would catch glimpses of him in parking lots near her workplace, see his vehicle parked on her street at night, and find evidence that he had been going through her trash and mail to gather personal information. The game had evolved from stalking to complete surveillance, and Rebecca understood that she was being prepared for something, being studied and catalogued like a specimen before an experiment that she might not survive. The nightmare, finally, ended when Rebecca made a desperate decision to break the pattern by pulling into a well-lit gas station during broad daylight and immediately calling the police from inside the store. When officers arrived, they found her stalker crouched behind her car in full view of multiple witnesses, no longer hiding, no longer playing games, but waiting with the kind of predatory patience that suggested he was ready to escalate from watching to acting. The man's vehicle contained detailed surveillance notes about Rebecca's daily routine, photographs taken with a telephoto lens from various locations around her home and workplace, and what investigators described as a kidnapping kit: zip ties, duct tape, rope, sedatives, and a detailed plan for abducting her from the gas station parking lot where their game had begun. The stalker was identified as Marcus Chen, a repeat offender with a history of escalating from surveillance to abduction, and investigators believe Rebecca's decision to call for help in a public place may have saved her life, because Chen's pattern showed that he typically moved from stalking to violent action within days of reaching the level of boldness he had demonstrated during their final encounter. Story 6. The Night Shift Killer. Tom had been working the overnight shift at the 24-hour gas station for 3 years when Martin first walked through the doors at exactly 3:17 a.m. on a cold October night. And from that very first encounter, every instinct Tom possessed screamed that this man was dangerous in ways that went far beyond the typical problems he dealt with during the graveyard hours. Martin was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through people, and he moved with the deliberate, measured gait of someone who had spent years learning to control violent impulses that constantly threatened to break free. His skin had the pale, unhealthy pallor of someone who had been institutionalized for a long time, and there was something about the way he held his hands, always slightly clenched, as if he was fighting the urge to use them for violence, that made Tom's survival instincts fire warning signals every time the man entered the store. Martin never bought anything during his visits, never asked for directions or made small talk like normal customers. Instead, he would simply stand in the store for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, staring at Tom with an intensity that made the fluorescent lights seem dimmer and the locked doors feel inadequate for protection. What made these encounters truly terrifying wasn't just Martin's presence, but the things he would say in his soft, conversational tone that somehow made his words more menacing than if he had been shouting threats. Martin would make casual observations about how isolated the gas station was, commenting on the fact that the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and that the building sat in a dead zone where cell phone reception was spotty at best. He would note how the security cameras had blind spots, how the back door's lock was old and could probably be picked easily, and how the bulletproof glass at the counter had a gap at the bottom that was large enough for someone to reach through if they really wanted to. These weren't random observations. They were the calculated assessments of a predator who was studying his hunting ground with the thoroughness of someone who had done this before and knew exactly what to look for when planning an attack. Martin spoke about violence with the detached fascination of someone who had intimate experience with it, describing in clinical detail how vulnerable night shift workers were, how they made perfect targets because they were alone, tired, and trapped in a building that was designed more for convenience than security. He would discuss different methods of breaking into buildings, the best times to strike when police response would be slowest, and the psychological techniques that could be used to break down a victim's resistance before moving to physical violence. These conversations were delivered in the same tone someone might use to discuss the weather, but the content was so specific and detailed that Tom realized he wasn't listening to theoretical discussions. He was hearing the planning stages of someone who was preparing to commit violence and wanted his intended victim to know it. Tom tried to ban Martin from the store, calling his manager and even contacting the police, but Martin kept returning with the persistence of someone who had found his perfect hunting ground and had no intention of giving it up. Sometimes he would hide in the storage room or the employee bathroom, emerging when Tom thought he was alone to continue their one-sided conversations about isolation, vulnerability, and the terrible things that could happen to people who worked alone in the dark hours when most of the world was asleep. The police couldn't do anything because Martin technically wasn't breaking any laws. He wasn't threatening Tom directly, wasn't damaging property, and wasn't preventing the business from operating. His presence was unsettling, and his conversations were disturbing, but until he actually committed a crime, law enforcement's hands were tied. The psychological torture escalated when Tom began finding evidence that Martin had been in the store. Even when Tom hadn't seen him arrive, personal items moved around, employee files rifled through, security camera angles mysteriously adjusted to create blind spots where someone could hide without being detected. Martin had somehow obtained keys or learned how to pick the locks, and he was using the gas station like his personal hunting ground, studying Tom's routines, learning his weaknesses, and making it clear that he could strike whenever he chose, to escalate from psychological warfare to physical violence. Tom would arrive for his shift to find his locker had been opened and his personal belongings examined, or discover that someone had been eating his food and reading his personal mail that he kept in the employee break room. The violations were small but constant, a steady erosion of Tom's sense of safety and privacy that was clearly designed to break down his psychological defenses. The most chilling discovery came when Tom found detailed notes written in Martin's handwriting hidden behind the cash register, notes that contained Tom's home address, his work schedule, his girlfriend's name, and disturbingly accurate observations about his daily habits both at work and in his personal life. The notes included information that could only have been gathered through extensive surveillance: what time Tom left for work, what route he took, where he stopped for coffee, even details about his girlfriend's schedule, and the fact that she worked late shifts at the hospital 3 nights a week, leaving Tom alone at home on his days off. Martin had been watching Tom's entire life, not just his work hours, and the notes suggested that he was planning something that would require intimate knowledge of Tom's routines and vulnerabilities. The surveillance extended beyond just observation. Martin had been actively gathering intelligence about Tom's life in ways that demonstrated sophisticated stalking techniques. He had somehow obtained Tom's phone number and would call the store during quiet hours, never speaking but staying on the line long enough for Tom to hear breathing and background noise that suggested Martin was calling from inside a vehicle parked nearby. Tom's girlfriend reported seeing a tall, gaunt man watching their apartment building from across the street on multiple occasions, and Tom's neighbors mentioned that someone had been going through the mailboxes and asking questions about the residents' schedules. Martin wasn't just stalking Tom at work. He was conducting comprehensive surveillance of his entire life, gathering the kind of detailed intelligence that suggested he was planning something far more elaborate and dangerous than a simple robbery or assault. The situation reached a terrifying climax when Tom arrived for his shift one night to find Martin already in the store, not hiding this time, but standing behind the counter as if he owned the place, going through the employee files with the casual confidence of someone who no longer felt the need to conceal his intentions. Martin was wearing different clothes than usual, all black, with gloves and boots that looked like they had been chosen for practicality rather than comfort. When Tom confronted him, Martin didn't run or make excuses. Instead, he smiled the cold, predatory smile of someone who had been waiting for this moment, and told Tom that he knew exactly where he lived, knew that he worked alone most nights, and knew that no one would miss him for hours if something were to happen during his shift. The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone Martin always used, but there was something different in his eyes now. A readiness that suggested he was done playing games and was prepared to move from psychological intimidation to physical violence. Martin began describing in detail what he planned to do to Tom, speaking with the clinical precision of someone who had thought through every aspect of the attack and was confident in his ability to carry it out successfully. He talked about how he would disable the security cameras, how he would prevent Tom from calling for help, and how he would ensure that the crime scene would be discovered in a way that would maximize the psychological impact on whoever found it. The descriptions were so specific and detailed that Tom realized he wasn't listening to threats or fantasies. He was hearing the final briefing of someone who had moved from planning to execution and was ready to begin the most violent phase of his campaign of terror. Tom managed to escape the store by pretending to go to the bathroom and then slipping out the back door, but not before he heard Martin calling after him with promises that this was only a temporary delay, that he knew where Tom lived and worked, and that there would be other opportunities to finish what he had started. Tom ran to his car and drove straight to the police station, where he demanded immediate protection and insisted that officers accompany him back to the gas station to arrest Martin before he could disappear again. What the responding officers discovered made Tom's blood run cold and confirmed that his instincts about Martin had been absolutely correct, and that his escape had quite literally saved his life. When they ran Martin's name through their database, they found that he had been released from prison just 3 weeks earlier, after serving 18 years for the brutal murder of a gas station attendant in a neighboring county, a killing that had happened during a night shift in an isolated station, under circumstances that were almost identical to Tom's current situation. The murder had been particularly savage, with evidence suggesting that Martin had spent weeks stalking his victim before the attack, learning his routines and vulnerabilities in exactly the same way he had used in his previous murder, and suggested that he intended to torture his victim for hours before killing him. Tom's narrow escape had prevented what would have been one of the most brutal crimes in the state's history, and his willingness to trust his instincts and seek help had quite literally saved his life and prevented Martin from beginning a new reign of terror that could have claimed multiple victims before he was finally stopped. Story 7. The Vanishing Station. When Alex's 15-year-old Honda broke down on a desolate stretch of highway at 2:30 a.m., the gas station that appeared in his headlights looked like divine intervention. Bright fluorescent lights cutting through the oppressive darkness, an illuminated open 24 hours sign promising salvation, and even what appeared to be several cars parked in the lot, suggesting that other travelers had found refuge there during the lonely hours of the night. The highway had been empty for the past 40 miles, with nothing but endless stretches of desert and the occasional abandoned building to break the monotony, so finding a functioning gas station felt like winning the lottery. Alex pulled into the lot with relief flooding through his exhausted body, already planning how he would call for a tow truck and maybe grab some coffee while he waited for help to arrive. But as he walked closer to the building, something fundamental felt wrong in a way that his rational mind couldn't immediately identify. Though every primitive survival instinct he possessed was screaming warnings that he was walking into a trap, the cars in the parking lot were the first sign that this wasn't the normal functioning business. It appeared to be from a distance. What had looked like recent arrivals from the highway were actually vehicles that had been sitting there for months, their tires flat and deflated, their windshields covered with a thick layer of dust and debris that spoke of long abandonment. Some of the cars had their doors standing open, as if their owners had simply walked away mid-task and never returned, leaving behind personal belongings scattered across the seats and dashboard items that had been bleached by sun exposure over countless days of neglect. The license plates were from different states and different years, suggesting that these weren't local vehicles but rather the cars of travelers who had stopped here and somehow never left, never continued their journeys, never made it back to the highway that stretched endlessly in both directions. Inside the gas station, The wrongness became even more pronounced and deeply unsettling. The lights were on and humming with electrical energy. The doors were unlocked and opened easily. But there was absolutely no one behind the counter. No employee visible anywhere in the building. No sign of human presence despite the fact that everything appeared to be operational and ready for business. The cash register was not only open but still contained money, crumpled bills and scattered coins that suggested the last transaction had been interrupted mid-process, as if the cashier had simply vanished while making change for a customer. On the counter sat a half-eaten sandwich that had long since grown a thick coating of green and black mold, and a cup of coffee that had evaporated down to a dark, crusty residue at the bottom, indicating that whoever had been working here had disappeared weeks or possibly months ago. The security cameras were still recording, their red lights blinking steadily as they documented the empty store. But when Alex tried to use the phone to call for help, he discovered that the lines were completely dead, producing not even a dial tone when he lifted the receiver. The most disturbing discovery came when he found the employee schedule still posted on the wall behind the counter, showing that someone named David was supposed to be working that night, and in fact had been scheduled to work every night for the past 3 weeks according to the handwritten roster. But David was nowhere to be found, and when Alex looked out into the parking lot, he could see a car that matched the employee parking designation with the keys still in the ignition, the driver's door standing open, and personal belongings including a wallet, cell phone, and half-finished energy drink sitting on the passenger seat, as if David had simply evaporated while walking from his car to the building. Alex's growing sense of dread reached a peak when he realized that this wasn't just a case of an employee abandoning his post or a business closing unexpectedly. This was something far more sinister and inexplicable. The gas pumps were still functional and accepting credit cards. The refrigerated sections were still cold and stocked with fresh merchandise, and the automated systems were still running as if the station was operating normally. But there were no human beings anywhere to be found. It was as if the entire staff had simply vanished into thin air, while the business continued to function without them. A ghost operation that maintained the appearance of normalcy while concealing something deeply wrong beneath the surface. The silence was oppressive and unnatural, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of the highway, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a horror movie set than a real place where people worked and conducted business. Panic finally overtook Alex's curiosity when he discovered evidence that suggested he wasn't the first traveler to stumble upon this abandoned station, and that others who had stopped here might not have been as fortunate in their escape. In the employee break room, he found personal belongings that clearly didn't belong to any gas station worker. A woman's purse with identification showing she was from 3 states away. A man's jacket with car keys in the pocket for a vehicle that wasn't in the parking lot. And a child's backpack containing school supplies and a lunch that had rotted away to nothing. These items suggested that other travelers had entered the station and somehow never left, never retrieved their belongings, never made it back to their cars, or continued their journeys down the highway that promised escape from this increasingly nightmarish place. Alex ran back to the highway and flagged down a passing trucker, who later told police that the gas station had been abandoned for over 6 months following a series of unexplained disappearances that had baffled local law enforcement and eventually forced the business to close. According to the trucker, 3 employees had vanished without a trace over the course of 2 months, all during night shifts, all leaving behind their personal belongings and vehicles with no sign of struggle or indication of where they might have gone. The first to disappear was David, the night shift manager whose schedule was still posted on the wall, followed by 2 other employees who had been brought in to replace him and who had also vanished under identical circumstances, simply failing to show up for their next shift and never being seen again. The investigation that followed Alex's report revealed that the gas station's automated systems had been running continuously since the disappearances, creating the illusion of a functioning business while concealing the fact that no human beings had been present for months. The credit card machines continued to process transactions. The security cameras continued to record empty rooms, and the lights continued to burn through the night, creating a perfect trap for unsuspecting travelers who might stop for help and find themselves in a place where people simply vanished without explanation. Even more disturbing was the discovery that the personal belongings Alex had found in the break room belonged to travelers who had been reported missing along that stretch of highway, people who had simply disappeared during cross-country trips, and whose cars had never been found despite extensive searches. Local authorities eventually shut down the station permanently and posted warnings along the highway. But the mystery of what happened to the missing employees and travelers was never solved. Some investigators theorized that the disappearances were the work of a serial killer who used the isolated station as a hunting ground, while others suggested that the victims might have been taken by human traffickers who targeted vulnerable travelers on remote highways. But no evidence was ever found to support any theory. No bodies were ever discovered, and no suspects were ever identified, leaving the case as one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries in the state's history. Alex's decision to flee the station and seek help probably saved his life, because investigators believe that whatever force was responsible for the disappearances was still active and that the station continued to function as a trap, luring unsuspecting travelers into a place where people entered but never left, where the lights stayed on but the human presence had vanished into something that defied explanation and left behind only questions that would never be answered. Story 8. The Watcher in the Woods. Sarah had been driving for 14 hours straight when exhaustion finally forced her to pull into what appeared to be the last gas station for miles along the remote mountain highway, a place so isolated that her GPS had lost signal 20 minutes earlier, and her cell phone showed no bars despite being on a major carrier network. The station looked normal enough from the outside. Standard pumps, a small convenience store with the typical bright lighting, and a hand-painted sign advertising coffee and snacks. But something about the surrounding forest felt wrong in a way that made her skin crawl even before she got out of her car. The trees pressed in too close to the building, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even with the station's lights, the darkness beyond seemed absolute and impenetrable, as if the forest was actively trying to swallow the small island of civilization that had been carved out of the wilderness decades ago. As Sarah filled her tank, she became increasingly aware that she was being watched from somewhere in the tree line, though every time she turned to look directly at the source of her unease, she saw nothing but shadows and the occasional movement that could have been wind stirring the branches. The feeling of being observed was so intense and persistent that she found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder, her primitive survival instincts screaming warnings that something predatory was studying her from the safety of the dense woods. The gas station attendant, an elderly man who looked like he hadn't slept in days, kept glancing nervously toward the forest as well, and when Sarah asked him about it, he simply shook his head and muttered something about things that come down from the hills when they get hungry enough, a response that did nothing to ease her growing sense of dread. The attendant's behavior became increasingly erratic as Sarah browsed the store, selecting snacks and coffee for the remainder of her journey. He kept checking and rechecking the locks on the doors, peering out the windows with the paranoid intensity of someone who expected an attack at any moment, and muttering under his breath about how they had been getting bolder lately, coming closer to the station, testing the boundaries of what they could get away with. When Sarah asked who they were, the old man's eyes went wide with fear, and he grabbed her arm with surprising strength, telling her that she needed to get back on the road immediately, that staying here after dark was dangerous in ways she couldn't understand, and that people who lingered too long at this station had a tendency to disappear without a trace. As if summoned by their conversation, a sound emerged from the forest that made both Sarah and the attendant freeze in terror. A low, guttural howling that didn't sound quite human but wasn't quite animal either. something that spoke of intelligence and malevolence in equal measure. The howl was answered by others from different directions, creating a chorus of inhuman voices that seemed to be communicating with each other, coordinating their movements as they closed in on the gas station like a pack of predators that had finally decided to move from observation to action. The attendant immediately began turning off lights and locking additional doors, his movements frantic and desperate as he transformed the welcoming convenience store into a fortress, barricading them inside while whatever was making those sounds continued to circle the building with increasing boldness. Through the windows, Sarah caught glimpses of movement in the tree line, shapes that moved too fluidly to be human, but too purposefully to be animals, figures that seemed to phase in and out of the shadows as if they were part of the darkness itself. The attendant explained in terrified whispers that these things had been plaguing the area for months, taking travelers who stopped at the station after sunset, leaving behind only abandoned vehicles and personal belongings scattered in the forest, as if their owners had simply vanished into thin air. He had tried to report the incidents to authorities, but the remote location and lack of concrete evidence meant that his warnings were dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of an isolated old man who spent too much time alone in the wilderness. The siege continued for what felt like hours, with the creatures testing the building's defenses, rattling doors and windows, and making sounds that suggested they were trying to find a way inside. Sarah could hear them moving across the roof, their footsteps too heavy to be human, but too coordinated to be random animals, and occasionally she would catch sight of eyes reflecting the station's lights from impossible angles, as if the things stalking them could climb walls and move through spaces that should have been inaccessible to any earthly creature. The attendant revealed that he had been trapped like this before, forced to wait until dawn when the creatures would retreat back into the deep forest, and that several travelers who had ignored his warnings and tried to leave during these nocturnal sieges had been found days later, their bodies arranged in ritualistic patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose behind the killings. As dawn finally approached, the sounds from outside gradually diminished, and the oppressive feeling of being watched began to fade as whatever had been stalking them retreated into the depths of the forest where daylight couldn't penetrate. The attendant explained that the creatures were photophobic, unable to tolerate direct sunlight, which was why the gas station remained safe during daylight hours but became a death trap after sunset. Sarah's car was still where she had left it, apparently untouched, but when she examined it more closely, she found deep scratches in the paint and what appeared to be bite marks in the tires, evidence that the creatures had been testing her vehicle's defenses and might have disabled it if she had tried to flee during the night. The most terrifying revelation came when the attendant showed Sarah a collection of personal belongings he had gathered from the forest over the months: wallets, jewelry, car keys, and identification documents belonging to dozens of travelers who had stopped at the station and never been seen again. He kept these items as evidence of what was happening, hoping that someday someone in authority would take his reports seriously and investigate the disappearances that had been plaguing this stretch of highway. Sarah's escape at dawn was only possible because she had heeded the attendant's warnings and waited for daylight. But as she drove away, she could see shapes moving in her rearview mirror, following her car from the safety of the forest until she finally reached a stretch of highway where the trees thinned out and the creatures could no longer pursue her without risking exposure to the sunlight that was their only weakness. The investigation that followed, Sarah's report uncovered a pattern of disappearances along that mountain highway, stretching back over 2 decades, with dozens of travelers simply vanishing without a trace after stopping at the isolated gas station. Local authorities had dismissed the reports as accidents or people choosing to disappear voluntarily, but Sarah's detailed account and the physical evidence she had photographed finally prompted a serious investigation. However, when investigators arrived at the gas station, they found it completely abandoned, with no sign of the elderly attendant or any of the personal belongings he had collected as evidence. The building showed signs of a violent struggle, with deep claw marks in the walls and floors and bloodstains that suggested something terrible had happened after Sarah's departure. The attendant was never found, and investigators theorized that his years of protecting travelers and documenting the creature's activities had finally made him a target for whatever was lurking in those woods, leaving behind only questions about what kind of predators could remain hidden in the modern world and continue hunting human prey with such systematic efficiency that their very existence remained a matter of speculation rather than accepted fact.